The psychological shockwave that rippled through the Japanese home islands on April 18, 1942, was an event of such profound and disorienting force that it fundamentally fractured the empire's carefully constructed narrative of invulnerability. In the months following the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese military machine had achieved a seemingly unstoppable string of victories, conquering vast swathes of territory from Hong Kong to the Dutch East Indies, and pushing Allied forces to the brink of collapse in the Philippines. This period of unchecked expansion was underpinned by a powerful domestic propaganda campaign that portrayed the Japanese homeland as a sacred, divinely protected fortress, far beyond the reach of any enemy retaliation. The sudden, inexplicable appearance of American B-25 Mitchell bombers, not as distant specks in a naval battle, but low over the very rooftops of Tokyo, Yokohama, and Kobe, was a reality-shattering event. For the first time, the distant abstract war was made terrifyingly tangible. The wail of air raid sirens was no longer a drill, the anti-aircraft fire was not for practice, and the explosions that rocked industrial targets and civilian neighborhoods alike were proof that the Imperial Navy's vast defensive perimeter had been effortlessly bypassed. The raid delivered a humiliating blow to the prestige of the military high command, particularly the Imperial Japanese Navy, which had assured the populace and the emperor of their absolute security. This single, audacious strike, while causing negligible physical damage compared to the strategic bombing campaigns to come, inflicted a deep and festering psychological wound, eroding public confidence and instilling a pervasive sense of vulnerability that contradicted everything the populace had been told. The myth of Japanese invincibility, a cornerstone of both military strategy and national morale, was irrevocably broken, replaced by the chilling realization that the American enemy, far from being cowed into a negotiated peace as anticipated, possessed both the ingenuity and the resolve to bring the war directly to the empire's heart. For the American public and military, still reeling from the sting of Pearl Harbor and the demoralizing setbacks across the Pacific, the Doolittle Raid served as an indispensable and electrifying tonic for the national spirit, a powerful declaration that the United States was only beginning to fight. In the dark early days of 1942, the news was almost unrelentingly grim. The surrender of Corregidor, the loss of Guam and Wake Island, and the relentless advance of Japanese forces created a palpable atmosphere of anxiety and uncertainty. President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his military advisors understood the desperate need for a bold, symbolic counterstroke, not merely to avenge December 7th, but to demonstrate to allies, adversaries, and the American people themselves that the nation's industrial might and martial ingenuity were awakening. The raid, conceived by the unorthodox brilliance of Captain Francis Lowe and planned and led by the fearless Lieutenant Colonel James "Jimmy" Doolittle, was a masterpiece of tactical innovation, proving that the seemingly impossible, launching fully loaded land-based bombers from a naval carrier, could be achieved with courage and meticulous preparation. When Roosevelt announced to a jubilant press that the bombers had originated from Shangri-La, a mythical hidden base, it added a layer of patriotic legend to the feat, transforming a high-risk military operation into a national epic. The sight of those 16 B-25s taking off from the heaving deck of the USS Hornet, a feat never before attempted, became an enduring image of American can-do spirit. The news of the raid's success, though the material damage was limited, provided a massive boost to morale on the home front, galvanizing the war effort and solidifying public support for the long and costly conflict ahead. It was a clear signal that the United States would not adopt a defensive posture, but would instead carry the fight to the enemy with audacity and relentless determination. The strategic consequences of the Doolittle Raid, while secondary to its profound psychological impact, were nonetheless far-reaching and directly catalyzed a chain of events that would alter the entire course of the war in the Pacific. The humiliation suffered by the Imperial Japanese Navy, whose leadership was apoplectic, that the sacred person of the emperor had been endangered, created an urgent and politically charged imperative to eliminate any future threat of such an attack. This imperative dovetailed with the existing contentious debate within the Japanese High Command regarding the next phase of the war. The raid acted as the final decisive argument in favor of the Imperial Japanese Navy's ambitious but risky plan to extend Japan's defensive perimeter by seizing the strategic outpost of Midway Atoll, luring the remnants of the American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle where it could be annihilated once and for all. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, believed that the capture of Midway would not only secure Japan's defensive sphere, but also serve as a potential base for a future invasion of Hawaii, thereby making a repeat of the Doolittle attack logistically impossible. This aggressive overreach, driven by a need to restore honor and ensure absolute security, played directly into American hands. Thanks to the monumental intelligence coup of breaking the Japanese naval code, JN-25, Admiral Chester Nimitz was aware of the planned assault and was able to position his outnumbered carriers for an ambush. The ensuing Battle of Midway in June 1942 resulted in the catastrophic loss of 4 of Japan's finest aircraft carriers, along with their elite air groups and irreplaceable veteran pilots. This single engagement, a direct operational consequence of the Doolittle Raid, shattered Japan's offensive naval power and shifted the strategic initiative irrevocably to the United States, marking the true beginning of the American counter-offensive that would culminate, island by bloody island, at the very doorstep of Japan itself. The planning stages of the Doolittle Raid were a testament to American ingenuity and a willingness to embrace unorthodox, high-risk solutions in a time of crisis. The concept itself was born from a casual observation by Navy Captain Francis Lowe, who noticed the outline of a bomber on a flight deck, painted onto an airfield runway, sparking the radical idea of launching Army Air Force's medium bombers from a Navy aircraft carrier. This initial concept was heretical in its defiance of conventional military doctrine, which strictly segregated the roles and equipment of the different service branches. The challenges were immense and seemingly insurmountable. A B-25 Mitchell bomber, with its wide wingspan and heavy load, had never been taking off from the confined space of a carrier deck, a feat considered physically impossible by many seasoned pilots and naval aviators. The project, once greenlit, was shrouded in utmost secrecy, with the military's most brilliant minds, including the renowned pilot and aeronautical engineer, Lieutenant Colonel James H. Jimmy Doolittle, working feverishly to solve a myriad of complex problems. They had to drastically reduce the aircraft's weight, fabricate and install extra fuel tanks to extend its range to a seemingly impossible degree, and meticulously calculate the precise takeoff speed and deck length required to get the heavily laden plane airborne. The selection of Doolittle, a revered figure in aviation, known for his coolness under pressure and technical expertise, was instrumental in transforming this theoretical concept into a viable, if still incredibly dangerous, operational plan. His leadership would be crucial not only in the planning, but in convincing the volunteer crews to undertake a mission from which return was statistically unlikely. A mission that would demand every ounce of their skill, courage, and fortitude. The training for the Doolittle Raiders was a brutal, accelerated course in the impossible, designed to forge a new type of aviator capable of executing a mission that defied all previous military precedent. The selected crews, volunteers who had stepped forward for a highly dangerous but unspecified mission, were initially baffled by the peculiar and demanding exercises they were ordered to perform. Under Doolittle's exacting supervision, they practiced taking off in their heavily modified B-25s within an absurdly short distance, sometimes as little as 500 feet, a maneuver that required full flaps, maximum engine power, and a delicate, precise liftoff that bordered on a controlled stall. They trained in low-level flying, skimming just 50 feet above the waves and the desert floor of Eglin Field in Florida, learning to navigate at high speeds mere feet above the ground to avoid enemy detection and anti-aircraft fire. This low-altitude training was physically and mentally exhausting, pushing both man and machine to their absolute limits as they learned to hug the terrain with a consistency never before required of multi-engine bomber crews. They also practiced night flying and navigation over vast, featureless stretches of water, skills that would be critical for finding their way to Japan and then onto the uncertain sanctuary of unsecured airfields in China. Every aspect of their training was compressed into a few short, intense weeks, a period marked by constant danger, grueling repetition, and the ever-present knowledge that a single error could mean death. Yet, through this crucible, Doolittle molded his men into a cohesive, supremely confident unit, honing their skills to a razor's edge and instilling in them the unwavering belief that they could accomplish what no one else had ever dared to attempt. The launch from the deck of the USS Hornet on the morning of April 18, 1942, was one of the most dramatic and perilous moments in the history of aerial warfare, a point of no return that transformed a secret plan into a world-altering reality. The mission's timeline was catastrophically accelerated when the naval task force was spotted by a Japanese picket boat hundreds of miles earlier than planned, forcing Doolittle and Admiral William Bull Halsey to make the agonizing decision to launch immediately. Despite being too far from Japan to guarantee the bombers would have enough fuel to reach safe havens in China. This meant the already slim chances of survival for the 16 crews plummeted, turning a high-risk mission into what many considered a suicide run. As the Hornet pitched and rolled in the heavy seas of the North Pacific, the crews made their final preparations. Their B-25s lashed to the deck and straining against their chains like wild beasts. With the order to launch, the engines of the first bomber, piloted by Doolittle himself, roared to life, and the plane began its lumbering, precarious roll down the rain-slicked deck, every man on the ship holding his breath. The bomber dipped alarmingly as it reached the end of the flight deck, its airspeed dangerously low, before seemingly clawing itself into the air just feet above the churning waves. A moment of such breathtaking tension that it was later described as a miracle. One by one, the remaining 15 B-25s repeated this harrowing feat, a testament to the intensive training and raw piloting skill of their crews. As the last plane vanished into the overcast sky, the Hornet turned back, leaving the 80 men to their fate, a small group of aviators now carrying the hopes of a nation on a one-way journey into the heart of the enemy empire. The bombing run over Japan itself was a brief, intense affair, a shocking and surreal intrusion of war into the everyday life of the enemy capital and its surrounding cities. Flying at treetop level to avoid detection, the B-25s weaved through valleys and over towns, their sudden appearance causing confusion and disbelief among the Japanese civilians and soldiers who saw them. The raiders encountered only sporadic and largely ineffective anti-aircraft fire and a few ineptly flown fighter planes, as their low-altitude approach and the complete element of surprise negated much of Tokyo's air defenses, which were prepared for a high-altitude attack that never came. The bombers struck their assigned military and industrial targets, an oil tank farm, a steel factory, a power plant, and dockyard facilities, with 500-pound bombs and incendiaries, creating plumes of black smoke that rose over the city. The physical damage inflicted was, in strategic terms, minor and easily repairable. The true weapon was not the explosive payload, but the act of the attack itself, the sight of American aircraft, bearing the White Star insignia, roaring with impunity over the Imperial Palace grounds and the heart of the capital was an image of profound symbolic power. It was a deliberate and masterful stroke of psychological warfare, a demonstration that the long arm of American retaliation could reach anywhere, that no place was safe. For 15 terrifying minutes, the war was no longer a distant conflict in Southeast Asia or the Central Pacific. It was here, in the skies above the homes and workplaces of the Japanese people, shattering the illusion of security that their military leaders had so carefully cultivated. The aftermath of the bombing run initiated a desperate and harrowing fight for survival, a saga of endurance that would test the raiders far beyond the combat phase of their mission. With their fuel reserves critically low due to the premature launch, the 16 crews pointed their aircraft toward the coast of China, flying through the night and into deteriorating weather, their destination a faint hope in a vast and hostile expanse. They were aiming for airfields in unoccupied Chinese territory, but none had enough fuel to reach them. One crew, recognizing their dire situation, diverged from the plan and headed for the closer but Soviet-controlled city of Vladivostok, where they were interned for over a year. As the other B-25s ran out of fuel over the dark, storm-lashed coast of China and the mountainous interior, the crews were forced to make a terrible choice: bail out into the unknown blackness or attempt a perilous crash landing. Most chose to parachute, the men spilling out of their aircraft into a violent rainy night, tossed by winds and dashed against mountainsides. The experience was one of utter chaos and terror, with men landing in trees, on rocky slopes, and in flooded rice paddies, scattered and isolated across a wide swath of territory. For those who survived the jump, the ordeal was just beginning, as they found themselves injured, disoriented, and alone in a foreign land, unsure of who among their comrades had lived and who among the local population might be friend or foe. The fate of the Doolittle Raiders in China became a dramatic and tragic subplot of the mission, highlighting the brutal nature of the war in the Pacific and the immense sacrifices made by both the American flyers and their Chinese allies. While the majority of the crews were eventually located and rescued by Chinese peasants and guerrilla fighters, who risked their own lives to provide shelter, medical aid, and guidance, the Japanese military responded to the raid with savage fury. Infuriated by the audacious attack and convinced that the Chinese had colluded with the Americans, the Imperial Japanese Army launched a massive punitive campaign, known as the Zhejiang-Jiangxi Campaign, into the eastern Chinese provinces where the raiders had landed. The Japanese forces swept through the region, systematically destroying villages, executing anyone suspected of aiding the Americans, and even resorting to deploying biological weapons. Tens of thousands of Chinese civilians were massacred in a brutal act of retribution, meant to terrorize the population and eradicate any future support for American operations. This horrific backlash underscored the profound interconnectedness of the global conflict and the heavy price paid by those caught in its wake. The Chinese people, who had already suffered years of brutal occupation, demonstrated incredible courage and humanity in sheltering the American airmen, an act of defiance that cost them dearly for the raiders. The knowledge that their survival had come at such a staggering cost to their rescuers would be a heavy burden to carry for the rest of their lives. The capture and subsequent ordeal of 8 of the Doolittle Raiders by the Japanese military exposed the deep-seated brutality of the enemy and the stark contrast between the American concept of a just war and Japanese militaristic fanaticism. The 8 men from 2 separate crews that had crash-landed or bailed out in Japanese-occupied territory were immediately taken prisoner and subjected to a period of intense, brutal interrogation. They were held in notorious prisons, such as the Bridge House in Shanghai and later in Nanking, where they endured systematic torture, malnutrition, and prolonged solitary confinement designed to break their will and extract confessions of alleged war crimes, such as the machine gunning of civilians and schoolchildren, accusations that were entirely fabricated by Japanese propaganda. The treatment of these men was a flagrant violation of the Geneva Conventions, reflecting the Japanese military's view of the raiders not as legitimate prisoners of war, but as criminal terrorists who had violated the sanctity of the homeland. After a sham trial, 3 of the raiders, Lieutenants Dean Hallmark, William Farrow, and Harold Spatz, were sentenced to death by a firing squad, a sentence that was personally approved by Emperor Hirohito himself and carried out in a cemetery outside Shanghai. The execution of these 3 men sent a chilling message to the United States about the merciless nature of the conflict, while the remaining 5 captured raiders endured 40 months of horrific conditions in prison camps, living under a constant threat of execution until their liberation at the end of the war.